Said our first speaker in this evening's program is Peter Dale Scott. Peter Dale Scott is a former Canadian diplomat and professor of English at the University of California, Berkeley. He's published 3 volumes of his poetry and countless books of prose. Most recently, he edited an anthology with David Ray Griffin called 9/11, An American Empire, Intellectuals Speak Out. Please join me in welcoming Peter Dale Scott.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read this talk because I want to argue quite closely. You've heard a great many things in this book that I'm going to say, but you may hear some of them a slightly different way because this is condensed from 2 chapters out of my forthcoming book, The Road to 9/11, Wealth, Empire, and the Future of America. There are only 2 chapters that deal with 9/11. It's a history of America since World War II. I do talk about things like Operation Northwoods that you've been hearing about here. And it's phrased rather cautiously because I believe it's being published by the University of California Press, and I believe that this will be the first university press volume that calls for the questioning under oath and possible impeachment of Vice President Dick Cheney. 9/11 is a controversial and unfashionable topic like the JFK assassination, and for the same reason. To ask questions about 9/11 risks raising questions about the legitimacy of our government. Above all, it raises questions about the radical restrictions of basic freedoms that have been introduced since September 2001. The more status someone has in this society, the harder it is for them to listen to suggestions that there is something illegitimate about the power structure in which they have that status. Thus, the paradox that ordinary people are more likely to disbelieve the official theories of 9/11 or of JFK than are people with higher education and greater access to information. So my book, which as I say, only 2 chapters deal with 9/11, it's addressed to this problem of the ignorance of the highly educated. Since January 2004, my website, www.peterdalescott.net, and don't go to .com because that's some enemy of mine who got it registered in Kenya. I don't know how. I am peterdalescott.net. Since January 2004, I have been calling for impeach Cheney first. But what I have written is not really a case for impeachment because I think at this stage impeachment would be premature, would probably fail. What we need is to build the case that Cheney is a suspect who must for the first time be required to testify under oath. The 9/11 report is an example of concerted cover-up, partly by omissions, and just as importantly, by its cherry-picking of evidence and contrived misrepresentations of fact. And there is a pattern to the misrepresentations. You know, it depends what audience you're speaking to. If you're going out on talk radio, it's fine to call the report a pack of lies. But in fact, the 9/11 report is carefully written, carefully footnoted, and it only really lies in certain places. There is a consistent pattern to the misrepresentations, and the pattern that I'm looking at is the consistent downplaying, trivialization of the role played by Cheney on that day. And I actually just looked between 9:20 a.m. and 10:39 a.m. And central to the report's analysis of the U.S. failure to stop the 9/11 attacks was the claim that crisis management on that day was decentralized among 3 independent teleconferences in the FAA, White House, and National Military Command Center, or NMCC, and for this reason, the government failed to generate a timely and coordinated response to the hijackings. However, it's pretty clear that all the most important orders that day, including an order grounding planes and a later shoot-down order, were issued to all 3 teleconferences from a single source. The source was the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, or PEOC, in the bunker underneath the White House where Dick Cheney was presiding. Cheney himself told Tim Russert of NBC on September 16, 2001, that from the PEOC, and I'm quoting, "I was in a position to be able to see all the stuff coming in, receive reports, and then make decisions in terms of acting with it." I shall argue that this early account by Cheney of his central role is far more accurate than his later account, in which he claimed to have arrived in the PEOC after most of the important decisions had already been made. Much of the 9/11 report attempts to give a full and balanced picture, but one of the exceptions is that the report suppressing contrary accounts will only present those versions of events which will exonerate or minimize the role of Cheney. This happens regularly enough to establish what I have elsewhere called a negative template or a pattern of recurring suppression. The details thus suppressed can be seen as indications or clues as to the important information that is being suppressed. Now, let me begin with an example which may at first seem insignificant, but in fact it isn't. The question of who ordered all the planes to land shortly after 9:42 a.m. at the nearest airport. In the report, this order is attributed to the man who promulgated it, FAA National Operations Manager Benedict Sliney, who was on his first day at the job. According to Sliney, the order was subsequently approved by his superiors, including FAA Deputy Administrator Monty Belger, and eventually, quote, minutes later, by Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta in the PEOC. But a year earlier, Mineta had testified to Congress that he himself, from the PEOC, issued the order. According to a corroborating Bob Woodward story, Mineta gave the order to Belger in the PEOC, with Cheney nearby and nodding approvingly. Interviewed a few months later, Mineta confirmed that he had issued the order to Belger, and he actually gives the dialogue in which he and Belger talked about this order. 9 months later, Mineta asserted his responsibility again to the 9/11 Commission. I submit that Mineta's account that the order was transmitted downwards through Belger to Sliney is more credible than Sliney's claim that he, on the first day at the job, initiated an order without precedent in aviation history and then advised his superiors. But the 9/11 report would ultimately report only the story from Sliney, which distanced Mineta and Cheney from the decision, and ignored Mineta's and Woodward's conflicting account. Nor did the Commission question Belger, who was a witness to the Commission, about Mineta's story. Thus, it missed an easy opportunity to corroborate or disprove Mineta's claim. This is only one instance of the report's agenda of removing the presence of Cheney from the important decisions made that day, and indeed removing him from the PEOC when they were made, for the report's chronology was not compatible with the story of a decision made in the bunker with Cheney's approval at 9:45, because, as you all know, the report claimed, ignoring other testimony, that Cheney did not arrive in the bunker until, quote, shortly before 10, perhaps at 9:58. Here as elsewhere, the report promoted a story minimizing Cheney's importance and suppressed a conflicting first-hand story from an important eyewitness. I agree with David Ray Griffin that this repeated suppression suggests intentionality, quote, not to provide the fullest possible account of 9/11, but to defend the account provided by the Bush administration and the Pentagon. All right, when did Cheney arrive at the PEOC? Well, I think at every single session I've attended, we have heard from everybody the conflict between the testimony of Secretary of Transportation Mineta, given an open hearing to the commission itself, that when he entered the bunker at about 9:20, Cheney was already there and fully in charge, but the commission, simply omitting Mineta's testimony from its final report, claims that Cheney, quote, and this is a quote now, arrived in the room shortly before 10, perhaps at 9:58. Griffin calls this claim that the vice president arrived in the room shortly before 10, quote, an obvious lie. It is arguably not a lie in the sense of a deliberate, baseless falsehood. I shall argue in the following pages that Cheney did enter the room at this time, as logs are said to indicate. But I suggest there is material misrepresentation in the word, quote, arrived, because Cheney had first arrived a half hour or more earlier and then left the room to go into the tunnel to have an important phone call with the president before returning at 9:58. The important claim that Cheney had first arrived well before 9:58 does not rely on Mineta's testimony alone. Richard Clark wrote that he saw Cheney preparing to leave the White House sometime long before 9:28. Now, how many people knew this? Cheney himself told Tim Russert of Meet the Press on September 16th, 2001, in an interview still available 5 years later on the White House website, that he arrived in the PEOC before the Pentagon was hit. In other words, before 9:37 a.m. But the 9/11 report suppresses this and follows a second account in Newsweek, which is based on an interview with Cheney himself, which now had him leave his office at 9:35 and arrive in the PEOC shortly before 10. We shall see that new evidence, which only surfaced about 6 months ago, corroborates Cheney's first story and makes his revised timetable extremely unlikely. Clearly, one of Cheney's two accounts of his arrival before 9:37 or around 9:58 must be wrong. Moreover, what is at stake here is not trivial. Important orders were issued in this hour from the PEOC. One alleged order, whose content is uncertain, which Mineta claims to have heard about 9:25, a second order to ground all planes at 9:45, and a third tripartite order, which according to Clark included a shoot-down order at about 9:50. By Mineta's account, corroborated by Clark, Cheney had arrived in the PEOC in time to give all three of these orders. By Cheney's second account, he arrived after all three were given. The report flagrantly and symptomatically failed to deal with Mineta's and Clark's testimony. Okay, what is this new evidence I'm talking about? It's the evidence that of a report from NEADS, from the NORAD, Northeast Air Defense Sector, of a third aircraft incoming at 9:21. In 2006, in connection with the release of the movie Flight 93, we learned for the first time that tapes from NEADS contained the following significant event. 9:21, 37 seconds. Dooley, another hijack. It's headed towards Washington. Nazipani, shit, give me a location. Unidentified male. Okay, third aircraft, hijacked, heading toward Washington. Now, this urgent message, which is a key to what happened in the next 20 minutes, is not repeated in the 9/11 report. It should have been. It corroborates Cheney's original account of his movements, that he arrived in the PEOC before the Pentagon was hit at 9:37, and it discredits the 9/11 report's estimate that an approaching plane at 9:34 or 9:35 prompted the Secret Service to order the immediate evacuation of the Vice President from his White House office just before 9:36. Richard Clarke revealed in his book that the Secret Service had a system which allowed them to see what FAA's radar was seeing. Thus, Secret Service must have known instantly of the 9:21 alarm. It's inconceivable that they did nothing for 14 minutes, and then at 9:35 acted so precipitously that, according to Cheney himself, they grabbed the Vice President by his belt, hoisted him up so that his feet barely touched the ground, and propelled him to the PEOC. Now, the footnotes to this claim in the 9/11 report appear to have been constructed with great care, but there has been cherry-picking of the evidence. The footnotes cite a Secret Service timeline memo for the Vice President's entry into the PEOC at 9:58 and also into the tunnel at 9:36. And I think these times are accurate if we imagine that Cheney entered the tunnel around 9:36, but from the bunker end, not the White House end, and then returned to the PEOC at 9:58. But what about the report's estimated departure from the Vice President's office just before 9:36? This should be easily verifiable or falsifiable, but from the Secret Service timeline. But here, the timeline is significantly not cited. And if we ever get that timeline, and I hope we will, I predict that we will find that the time on the timeline is not 9:36 at all. It's much more likely to be close to 9:21. No, I think that's too early. The Mineta story of Cheney and an incoming plane, which you all know about. The Needs warning of an incoming plane at 9:21 also corroborates Mineta's story, that at 9:26 he heard Cheney reaffirm orders with respect to an incoming plane. Now, as you know, Mineta came, I'm going to skip here because you all know this story. Is there anyone who doesn't know the story about Mineta and the Cheney and the incoming plane? The important dialogue is the young man who had come in and said to the Vice President, the plane is 50 miles out, the plane is 30 miles out, and when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the Vice President, do the orders still stand? And the Vice President turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? Now, Commissioner Romer, questioning Mineta, established that this would have been about 9:25 or 9:26. However, the 9/11 Commission claimed that a primary radar target tracking eastbound at a high rate of speed towards Dulles Airport was only discovered at 9:32 a.m. What about that incoming plane at 9:21, which they didn't mention? Unquestionably, the 9:21 report of a third hijack was a crucial event on September the 11th. It led immediately to the launching by Needs of planes from Langley, Virginia. And here is the order in that same minute. Okay, American Airlines is still airborne, 11, the first guy, he's heading towards Washington. Okay, I think we need to scramble Langley right now, and I'm going to take those fighters from Otis and try and chase this guy down if I can find him. Because of the misidentification in the second message, the report referred to this as a response to a phantom aircraft, an aircraft that did not exist. Now, at first glance, the Needs report of an incoming third aircraft at 9:21 would appear to be the plane Mineta referred to. It also fits neatly with NORAD General Arnold's initial testimony to the Commission that NORAD learned of Flight 77's hijacking at 9:24 a.m. Now, the 9/11 reporter rejected Arnold's testimony as incorrect. What it meant by this was that the plane reported was not identified as Flight 77. Instead, these were, quote, reports about a plane that no longer existed, American 11. Thus, the report claimed Need's air defenders had no advance on the third plane. Now, in their book, Keane and Hamilton, relying on the same quibble about the identification of the plane, are even more misleading. In their words, quote, NORAD claimed that the Langley jets were scrambled in pursuit of American 77, yet that was impossible. At 9:24, NORAD had not yet been notified that American 77 had been hijacked, close quote. It was not impossible. On the contrary, it was pretty clearly the case, even if controllers were not yet aware of the identity of the plane to which they were responding. Now, this handling of the plane alarm illustrates the distinction between an outright lie and a deliberately constructed deception. The reports claim that aircraft were scrambled in, quote, response to a phantom aircraft, close quote, is carefully crafted language which a lawyer could conceivably persuade a courtroom judge to accept as not untrue. Yet the impression created that NORAD was not warned early enough to deal with an approaching plane was materially misleading and indeed false. The real issue at the time was not the identification of the plane, but the urgent concern that a plane was headed towards Washington. This corroborates Minetta's detailed account of this moment elsewhere. And this time it comes back to Belger again. Someone came in and said, Mr. Vice President, there's a plane 50 miles out. I was on the phone with the Deputy Administrator of FAA, Monty Belger, and he said, we have a target, but the transponder's turned off, so we have no identification, no ident on the aircraft. I said, can you tell in relationship to the ground where it is? He said, no, that's difficult to do, but I imagine it's somewhere between Great Falls and National Airport coming in. It seemed it was on what they call the DRA, the Down River Approach. That's down the Potomac. In other words, the route described by Belger approximates the eastward route towards Washington that was being followed in this time frame by American 77, or if you have a different theory about Washington, about the Pentagon, as many people do, about the plane that we were told was American 77. It's possible, in fact, that it was a different plane. I don't want to get into that here. But once again, there is no sign that Belger was interrogated by the 9/11 Commission about this. His testimony could have confirmed or refuted Minetta's detailed account of what happened at this time in the PEOC, and in the 9/11 report, once again, no mention of Minetta's story about the incoming plane. Now, Minetta, in telling his story to the 9/11 Commission, stated unambiguously that the story referred to, quote, the plane coming into the Pentagon. In 2002, the White House floated an alternative to the Minetta story, implying that Minetta got both the time and the plane wrong. And once again, they relied on an interview with Cheney and also with Cheney's aide, Joshua Bolten. So CNN suggested in September 2002 that a dialogue similar to that reported by Minetta did occur, but with respect to Flight 93, sometime after the Pentagon was hit at 9:37. The 9/11 report did not refer to this important Cheney-Bolton allegation either. Indeed, it tacitly implied that the story was false by suggesting that there was no military response to Flight 93 and that the only shoot-down order occurred after Cheney entered the PEOC at 10. So instead, by relying on what authorities? Lynn Cheney's notes and Lewis Libby's notes, and we know quite a lot about Lewis Libby's credibility now. I wrote this a year ago before he'd been indicted. The 9/11 report recorded a third version of the incoming plane story, unambiguously postponing the dialogue until after Flight 93 was downed at 10:03. And this is a quote from the report. At some time between 10:10 and 10:15, a military aide told the Vice President and others that the aircraft was 80 miles out. The Vice President authorized fighter aircraft to engage the inbound plane. The military aide returned a few minutes later, probably between 10:12 and 10:18, and said the aircraft was 60 miles out. He again asked for authorization to engage. The Vice President again said yes. But the aide's behavior is far more implausible in this version than in Minetta's. One can understand his repeatedly questioning a stand-down order as the plane got closer, but why would an aide need to ask more than once for authorization to engage as the plane got closer? No one has suggested that nearly identical versions of the incoming plane story happened 2 or 3 times in the space of less than an hour. Thus, investigators should be granted access to the notes of Lynn Cheney and Louis Libby, which suggested that the story of the incoming plane occurred an hour later than Minetta claimed. As we shall see, this is not the only situation where someone's account of what happened not only must be wrong, but may possibly have been falsified. And this is where interrogation under oath could lead either to charges of perjury or to a very different story as to what really happened. With respect to the earlier Minetta version of the story, we must ask what would have been the orders that Minetta claims to have heard Cheney allude to. We do not know of a shoot-down order at this time. Above all, as Griffin notes, it would have made little sense for the young man to ask, when the plane was 10 miles out, if shoot-down orders still stood. Griffin raised the alternative possibility that it was a stand-down order, orders not to have the aircraft shot down. Now let's go to the shoot-down order, because there's 2 different versions of when that happened, and I'm going to start with Richard Clark's. There is cherry-picking again of the evidence with respect to the tripartite order authorized by President Bush in Tampa in a phone call with Dick Cheney. There is no logbook citation in the 9/11 report for the shoot-down order, which Richard Clark says clearly was before Air Force One left Tampa at 9:54 a.m. And this is from Clark's book. At that moment, Paul Kurtz handed me the white phone to the PEOC. It was Major Fenzel. Air Force One is getting ready to take off. Tell the Pentagon they have authority from the President to shoot down hostile aircraft. Repeat, they have authority to shoot down hostile aircraft. It cannot be less unambiguous than that. But the 9/11 report, while stating there is, quote, no documentary evidence, close quote, for Cheney's call to the President, suggests that the shoot-down order occurred after Cheney's, quote, arrival or return to the PEOC. It's significant that the report cites no record of Cheney's phone call to the President, the most important event of that day. It gives no record either of Cheney's phone call with Rumsfeld at this time, which Rumsfeld revealed, but about which the report is silent. The easiest explanation of why there is no record of the phone call would be that Cheney was not in the bunker where people were taking notes and logs were being kept, and everyone agrees, even Cheney himself, that he used a secure phone in the tunnel at around this time to phone the President. This matter should have been resolvable by going to the records of the White House Communications Agency, which handled the White House phone network. They kept logs, the Secret Service kept logs, and we have logs from that day that record phone calls at 9:15 a.m. and at 9:20 a.m., and another phone call at 10:18 a.m. But Thomas Keene, the commission chairman, complained publicly that the logs were not complete. This is Keene. The phone logs don't exist because they evidently got so fouled up in communications that the phone logs have nothing, so that's the evidence we have. And then Lee Hamilton came right after him and said, there's no documentary evidence here, meaning for the shoot-down order. The only evidence you have as the statements of the President and Vice President. We have thus the equivalent of the notorious 18-minute gap which was discovered in the course of the Watergate investigation. The 9/11 Commission does not present any records from the logs for the time of the phone call, only for calls earlier and later. We can imagine 4 possible reasons for this, and they're all suggestive of a much bigger story than we know so far. 1, the logs could have been massaged and cleansed and purged before they got to the Commission. 2, the logs could have been purged by the Commission or its staff. 3, and this is what I suspect, that the phone in the tunnel was a back channel where logs were either not kept at all or, and this is my real suspicion, had a higher classification than was ever made available to the Commission. I suspect the latter because one of the topics clearly that Cheney was discussing was a very important and very highly classified subject, continuity of government, COG, and I'll say more about that soon. For the unrecorded phone calls resulted in a triple order covering 3 matters, of which 2 are not disputed. 1, protection for Air Force One, and 2, continuity of government. Continuity of government, or COG, was a long-established plan radically revised in the Reagan era by Cheney and Rumsfeld for a response to an emergency which, among other things, this is a quote from back in the 80s, set aside constitutional and statutory requirements and established its own process for creating a new American president. Now, in reporting this, James Mann, in his book, Rise of the Vulcans, noted correctly that the original purpose of the plans was to keep the federal government running and during and after a nuclear war. But under Reagan, the planning was enlarged by executive order to cover, quote, any national security emergency, including natural disaster, military attack, technological emergency, or other emergency. And this enabled Cheney, after discussions with Bush and Rumsfeld, to implement COG on September the 11th, 2001. Pretty clearly, I think, before 9:54 a.m. In the road to 9/11, I argue that one consequence has been the barrage of recent orders, such as suspension of habeas corpus, infringing on the traditional rule of law. COG would explain why Cheney exited the bunker for his calls to Rumsfeld and Bush. The classification of COG was so high that most people in the bunker were not cleared to hear them. These were the most important calls Cheney made that day, and yet the report tells us there are no objective records of the call to Bush, and it makes no mention at all of Cheney's call to Rumsfeld. Now, the third part of the tripartite order, the content of which is disputed, was about planes. And according to Richard Clark, as you've already heard, it gave the shoot-down order. To repeat his own words, Air Force One is getting ready to take off. Tell the Pentagon they have authority from the President to shoot down hostile aircraft. Repeat, they have authority to shoot down hostile aircraft. Clark says that he then transmitted this order, which came from the bunker, to General Myers and Rumsfeld at the Pentagon, along with the order instituting COG. Now, this 3-part order is echoed in the 9/11 report from a Defense Department transcript at approximately the same time, but with a significant difference which rephrased and, in effect, suppressed the shoot-down order. At 9:59, this is the report citing a Defense Department transcript. At 9:59, an Air Force lieutenant colonel working in the White House military office joined an MCC conference and stated that he had just talked to Deputy National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley, who was with Cheney. The White House requested, 1, the implementation of continuity of government measures, 2, fighter escorts for Air Force One, and 3, a fighter combat air patrol over Washington. This is supposed to be at 9:54 when Clark had already requested it at 9:28 and the planes had been launched. The Clark version of the tripartite call and the DoD transcript version are clearly in conflict. One or the other account must be false. These significant divergences illustrate the need for historians to access all records, both those made available to the 9/11 Commission and those apparently never requested by them. Important in the second category would be the videotape of Richard Clark's White House teleconference, which transmitted the tripartite order, along with all the records about the implementation of COG that day, which presumably was recorded on the White House videotape. With respect to the tripartite order and its order for combat aircraft, it seems clear that someone, either Clark or the DoD transcript cited by the report, has misrepresented it. I'm not aware of any reason to mistrust the bona fides of Clark, but the report has been repeatedly evasive, if not misleading, with respect to decisions taken by Cheney. What could be so sensitive about this issue would be if, as David Ray Griffin has suggested, an order, a shoot-down order, may have been given in time to shoot down Flight 93, possibly even after it was already known on the ground that the passengers of Flight 93 had overcome their hijackers. Now I'm going to talk about a very strange sort of pause in the activity of three key figures that day, the President, Cheney, and Rumsfeld. According to the 9/11 report, it took Cheney 18 minutes to traverse the short tunnel into the bunker. And here's their account of what he did. Once inside, Vice President Cheney and the agents paused in an area of the tunnel that had a secure phone, a bench, and television. The Vice President asked to speak to the President, but it took time for the call to be connected. He learned in the tunnel that the Pentagon had been hit, and he saw television coverage of smoke coming from the building. What a moment to be watching television. This account of Cheney's isolation parallels the similar synchronous absence from his post that morning of Rumsfeld, when, according to the report, he was in the parking lot of the Pentagon to assist with rescue efforts. The head of our huge defense structure at a time when the nation is under attack for the first time is not at his post, he's out in the parking lot. Brigadier General Montague Winfield later told ABC News that, quote, for 30 minutes we couldn't find him. And just as we began to worry, he walked into the door of the National Military Command Center. Chairman Keane and Hamilton later agreed in their book that, quote, Rumsfeld did not get on the air threat conference until 10:39 because he had been assisting Pentagon rescue efforts, close quote. Their report found nothing strange in the Defense Secretary's prolonged absence from his post at a time when he was involved in crucial decisions when the nation was under attack. In the same period, there was a synchronous pause, not originally reported, in the movements of President Bush. Those with him in Tampa later spoke of a threat to the president there and of an ensuing mad dash to get off into the air. Karl Rove told ABC News, and this is Karl Rove's own words, before we could both of us sit down in the plane cabin and put on our seatbelts, they were rolling the plane. Hear that. Before we could put on our seatbelts, they were rolling the plane. And they stood that 747 on its tail, and it got to about 45,000 feet as quick as I think you can get a big thing like that in the air. And Bob Woodward, in his book, Bush at War, has a very similar account about this instantaneous departure at the airport. Thus, one is surprised to learn in the 9/11 report that, in fact, the plane paused on the runway for 10 minutes. While the president conferred with Cheney, and parenthetically, and Cheney conferred with Rumsfeld. And this is a quote from the report. The president's motorcade departed at 9:35. arrived at the airport between 9:42 and 9:45. The President boarded the aircraft and called the Vice President. Air Force One departed at approximately 9:54 without any fixed destination. And it reports that deadpan is not mentioning that they're implicitly saying that what Karl Rove and Bob Woodward wrote was just not true. The impression I have gathered from all this is that for at least 10 or 15 minutes before 10 a.m., 3 men, of whom 2 were in isolation, were making vitally important decisions while the rest of the U.S. government simply waited. Now, failure to intercept. Again, every session practically has talked about this. And I'm going to skip what I say here. The failure to intercept the hijackings also demands a more searching explanation than the report offers. FAA reported 67 interceptions between September 2000 and June 2001. And as everyone here has heard, a celebrated example of prompt interception was with the crippled airplane of golfer Payne Stewart in 1999, which had fighter aircraft on its wingtips only 19 minutes after it was observed erring off course. The report indicates that the failure to intercept on 9/11 derived from the issuance on June 1, 2001, of a JCS memo specifying, in the words of the report, that military assistance from NORAD required multiple, and that would include intercepts, by the way, required multiple levels of notification and approval at the highest levels of government. But the report asks no questions about who issued the June 2001 JCS memo. If we had a memo that was giving an absurd order which overruled the past distinction between emergency responses to planes off course and other responses to hijack, wouldn't you want to know where that order came from? It was an absurd order. It conflated the rules for emergency intercept with the rules for a hijack. And by the way, this absurd conflation was removed in December 2001. You have the sort of feeling that maybe it had served its purpose by then. Researcher Michael Rupert, who interviewed many people inside the military, and especially NORAD, concluded that the change can be traced to the White House announcement of May 8, 2001, in which President Bush asked Vice President Cheney to oversee the development of a coordinated national effort against terrorist weapons of mass destruction. As the Houston Chronicle reported the next day, President Bush on Tuesday directed FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to tackle the additional task of dealing with terrorist attacks. To accomplish that goal, Bush appointed Vice President Dick Cheney to head a terrorism task force and created the Office of National Preparedness within the Federal Emergency National Agency. I doubt that it was coincidental that Cheney, who with Rumsfeld and FEMA planned COG in the 1980s, implemented COG on September the 11th, was also responsible with Rumsfeld, was also responsible with FEMA for this planning in May of 2001. Now, going back to the 1980s, in their planning, which bypassed congressional leaders, Cheney was officially no more than a congressman from Wyoming, while Rumsfeld, who at the time was CEO of a drug company, was not officially in the government at all. And yet they were charged to plan for suspension of the American Constitution. The action officer for this secret planning in the 1980s until his dismissal in 1986 was Oliver North, working under Vice President George H.W. Bush in the National Security Council. Cheney, Rumsfeld, and North were assisted in the role by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, which created a cover agency, quote, with the bland name of the National Program Office. In this way, the Cheney-FEMA counterterrorism alliance of the 1980s was reconstituted in May of 2001, and the bland-sounding National Program Office was reconstituted as the bland-sounding Office of National Preparedness. To this day, we do not really authoritatively know the consequences of having instituted COG on 9/11. We do know that Cheney himself frequently disappeared from public view after the attack. At these times, he too was working from a COG base, Site R, the so-called underground Pentagon on the Maryland-Pennsylvania border. As the Washington Post later reported, he became, in effect, the leader of what the Washington Post called a U.S. shadow government. We have to ask whether Cheney's teams were not crucial in implementing COG programs from the 1980s, once associated with Oliver North, programs such as warrantless eavesdropping, including of domestic dissidents, warrantless other surveillance, warrantless detention, plans for martial law and overriding the Posse Comitatus Act, and the use of association as grounds for deportation. All of these things were planned in the 1980s, and we've seen them all since 2001. I have a whole chapter on this, which is being very radically condensed here. Some of these ideas from the 1980s were incorporated almost immediately in the USA Patriot Act, which clearly had been drafted before 9/11. The erosion of Posse Comitatus, which began right after 9/11, was consummated without debate, perhaps even without congressional awareness, in the October 2006 defense budget bill. The suspension of the FISA Act to eliminate judicial review of warrantless eavesdropping was initiated with no legal justification at all. Attorney General John Ashcroft took immediate steps after 9/11 to implement a central COG idea from the 1980s, arbitrary detention. Starting in September 2001, this is a quote, hundreds of non-citizens were swept up on visa violations, held for months in a much criticized federal detention center in Brooklyn, and then deported. Were these sweeping programs envisaged by Cheney and Rumsfeld in their secluded discussions on 9/11? And would this explain why they sought isolation rather than a regular phone conversation in front of their colleagues? So my conclusions. One more page. In this talk, I have focused on anomalies in the behavior, especially on 9/11, of Richard Cheney. He, along with Donald Rumsfeld and others, should testify under oath about, 1, the June 1st JCS order ordering highest level approvals for intercepts of off-course planes. 2, the contested time of Cheney's arrival in the presidential bunker. 3, Cheney's orders with respect to a plane approaching Washington, and did this occur around 9:27 a.m., as testified to by Mineta, or 10:15 a.m., as per the 9/11 report? 4, Cheney's call or calls with Rumsfeld and the president before or about 10 a.m., and did they discuss so-called continuity of government, COG? I always call it change of government. How you can call what has been happening continuity of government, it's been the most radical change in the legal structure of this country that we have ever seen since the Alien Sedition Act of 1798. And by the way, in an article that I wrote, I'm departing from my text here, but it's so amazing. Homeland Security instituted, starting in September 2001, a 10-year program to build massive detention centers. And in their statement about the program, which has since been taken down from their web after I reported it, it said it was implementing an idea in the Alien Sedition Act of 1798. I thought that in history it had moved away from that sort of thing. There are two other things which I think Cheney should be asked about. Is it true, as said in one authoritative book, that Cheney overruled plans to send enough U.S. forces to surround Tora Bora in Afghanistan, and thereby we would have captured Osama bin Laden, or did he possibly prefer that Osama bin Laden escape so that he could still be around to appear from time to time on TV? And 6, the grotesque order of Bremer to disband the Iraqi army and much of the Iraqi police in the summer of 2003. This overruled a national security order, and the book Fiasco says that Bremer was told to do it by Vice President Cheney. Did Cheney want Iraq to become a quagmire where our U.S. troops would be bogged down forever? The story that the report presented was embarrassing enough, of a multi-billion defense system that broke down on 9/11 and completely failed to perform its allotted function. But the report's systematic and repeated distortions lead one to suspect that some even more embarrassing truth is being concealed, and that this truth has to do with the orders given on that day by the Vice President. I believe that COG may be the answer to the mystery question about Cheney's actions at a time when he was talking to the President in Rumsfeld. If so, the 3 men were certainly not acting on their own. Rather, they would have been key figures in a highly classified secret agenda that must have involved other people. The question to be explored is whether that agenda involved revising the U.S. constitutional balance of powers, and whether Cheney on 9/11 was primarily occupied in exploiting the attacks as a means to implement an agenda of constitutional revision which he already had in place. The 9/11 Commission decided that its supporting evidence and records should be withheld from public view until January 2nd, 2009, a date which would obviously ensure the President and the Vice President from possible impeachment. But many would concede that since 9/11, and as a result of 9/11, the American nation has drifted towards a constitutional crisis requiring a change of policy direction. The issues posed by what happened on 9/11 are very relevant to this crisis and too significant to be postponed until 2009. As it did belatedly in the case of the John F. Kennedy assassination, Congress should initiate a procedure for these records to be reviewed and released expeditiously. Records that should be released would include all of the phone logs from the White House on 9/11 to determine as a matter of priority the precise time and circumstances of Cheney's orders on that day. They would also include materials such as COG files and the videotape of the White House teleconference that the Commission apparently never requested. The public also needs to establish why other records requested by the Commission did not initially reach them. And then, I believe, it would be appropriate for a venue to be established in which the Vice President would testify for the first time about 9/11 under oath. Thank you very much.